Created with free version for non-commercial use.
In this lesson, we will learn about CSS sprites. Now, instead of trying to explain what a CSS sprite is with only words, let's jump straight into a visual demonstration. In front of you is an example page, and we see 3 new icons or buttons. When we hover over one of the buttons, it lights up with a unique color. So this first icon is a house, and it represents the home of the website or app. This second icon is supposed to be a user or person, which would represent a profile page. And this third icon is supposed to be a gear, which represents a settings screen. Now, these icons were hand-drawn in about 2 minutes by yours truly, so feel free to mock them. They are for educational purposes only. But what's important is that this menu of icons is an example of CSS sprites. So what does that phrase mean? Why are these sprites? What is a sprite? It's all related to the way that the image files for these icons are stored. So on my desktop, there is a PNG graphic file named sprites. And when I double click it, it pops up. And you can see that this is the graphic file that contains all of the icons. The phrase sprites simply means that we're storing all of the icons in one image file instead of having 6 different image files for the 6 different graphic states. You may be wondering, why in the world would we do this? Why wouldn't we just include 6 different image files for the 6 different icons? And the answer is speed, page load times. Every time you visit a website, your web browser has to connect to a certain server and download all of the files associated with the website. So there are graphic files, CSS files, JavaScript files, and for each file, your browser has to make an HTTP request, which takes time. So by using CSS sprites, we're reducing the number of HTTP requests, which means we're reducing the time it takes to load our web pages. And in the modern era, speed is everything. Users don't want to wait. So if there's something we can do to make our pages faster, we should do it. So at this point, we know what a sprite is. We know why we use sprites. The only thing we're missing is the how. How do we create sprites? I'm going to hop over to another tab, and we can see that there are no icons. There is just a menu of links: home, profile, and settings. So for the remainder of this lesson, we are going to work together to rewrite the code to turn this text-based menu into an icon-based menu that uses CSS sprites. Let's get started. I will begin by moving the sprites.png graphic file to live within the same folder as our website. So here is index.html. We have an images folder to stay organized. So I'm going to drag the sprites file into the images folder. With that in place, let's review the HTML that is currently creating this text-based menu. It's nothing more than a nav element using an unordered list and a list item structure. And we see that the parent nav element has a class of UI menu. So over in our CSS file, I've included a bit of basic code that you should be familiar with. All we are doing is floating the list items to the left. We are removing the default bullets that list items receive, and we've added a bit of margin right so that there is space between the 3 links. So let's write a bit of new CSS code that targets the actual anchor or A elements. UI menu, A. So we want the links to be block level, so display block. And now we can specify a width and height. Now I created these graphics myself, so I know that each icon is 50 pixels wide by 50 pixels tall. So I will give the link elements a width of 50 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, and here is the beginning of the heart and soul of CSS sprites. It's all centered around a background image. So I will point the browser towards this ping file that we keep referencing. Background image, URL. Go into the images folder and grab the sprites.png file. So if I save and refresh, we see 2 problems. Number 1, we have both text and icons, which looks awful. And number 2, all 3 links are using the home icon. So first, let's fix the text issue. We want to hide the text. We will add a new declaration, text indent negative 9,999 pixels. So that hides the text. So now the only problem is all 3 links are using the home icon. So we need to send different CSS instructions to each link to have it show the appropriate part of our graphic file. So we need a way to distinguish between the 3 links. So in our HTML code, I'm going to add unique classes to each list item. So the first will have a class of UI home. I'll give the second a class of UI profile, and the third a class of UI settings. Now we can write CSS that targets or selects these unique class names. Now the home link is already showing the correct part of the background image. So let's work on the UI profile class. So in our CSS file, I'll create a new rule, UI profile, and select the A or link element within that. So we're going to use the background position property. Now if we look at our graphic file, we are interested in displaying this portion of it, this 50 by 50 pixel square. So in order to display this portion, we can use the background position property and specify that we want to move down 50 pixels from the top. Now, in an earlier lesson, we learned about keywords like top left or bottom right, but we can also specify 2 numerical values. So the first controls the horizontal position, and the second value controls the vertical. Now we know that we want to move 50 pixels down vertically. If I include a positive value of 50 pixels, the web browser will push the background image down, so we will actually see this 50 pixel square. Or in other words, we'll see nothing. Now I can illustrate this by making sure that I add the background repeat, no repeat property to the universal link rule. So if I save and refresh, we see that the second link is now empty. So obviously we don't want to move 50 pixels in this direction. We want to move 50 pixels in this direction. So I can simply make this a negative value, negative 50 pixels vertically. So if we refresh, we can see we're in business. Next, let's create the styles for the third link, which is supposed to be the settings gear. We'll create a new rule, UI settings, select the A element, background position. So now we know that we want to move down 100 pixels from the top to select this area. So background position will be 0 and negative 100 pixels. There you have it. Next, let's work towards adding the hover effects. So in our graphic file, we can see that to the right of each icon is the version that uses unique colors. And we want that version to display when we hover over one of the particular icons. So let's begin by writing the CSS for the home hover icon. I'll create a new rule, UI home, select the A element, use a pseudo selector of hover. Background position, negative 50 pixels horizontal, and 0 pixels vertically. So if we refresh and hover over the home icon, we see the hover effect. Next, let's apply that same logic to the profile and settings icons. So I'm going to adjust this code to sit on a single line just to stay organized. I can simply copy this line for the profile style, paste it, and on the duplicate, add a pseudo selector of hover. And because we copied and pasted this line, the vertical positioning is already correct for the profile icon. We just need to adjust the horizontal positioning. Or in other words, this style is already selecting this portion of the background image. So let's simply push its horizontal positioning 50 pixels to the right. So I'll adjust this first value to negative 50 pixels. So if I save and refresh and hover over the user or profile icon, we see that the hover effect is in place. And finally, let's create the hover effect rule for the settings icon. So let's modify this to sit on a single line. Let's duplicate it via copy and paste. Adjust the duplicate to use the hover pseudo-selector on the A element, and adjust the horizontal positioning of the background to -50 pixels. So if we save and refresh, the gear is also using the hover effect, which means our CSS Sprites menu is now complete. That will bring this lesson to a close, but first, here's a quick review. We use sprites for small icon-based graphics on our web pages, because by combining these graphics into one file, it makes our pages load faster. We learned that the CSS recipe for sprites is nothing more than assigning a background image and then using a bit of trickery with the background position property. So this way we can display different portions of the image for different elements on the page. And finally, I want to talk a bit about the actual graphic file that we saw referenced throughout the lesson. I used Photoshop to combine and align the icons perfectly in a 50 pixel grid. If you don't have access to Adobe Photoshop, that's not a problem. You can use the image editing software named GIMP. It's freely available for all major platforms. And obviously, you do not need to use a 50 pixel grid. However you want to align your different icons so that you can easily write CSS to display the correct portions is fine. If you need to include icons in your web pages, I encourage you to experiment with the sprites method. Have fun, and I will see you in the next lesson.
Created with free version for non-commercial use.